Well, it's time to start. Welcome everyone to this last lecture, Institute lecture before Christmas. People are probably getting busy preparing for Christmas, but we are looking forward to a lecture today by Filip Ivanovic. He is now currently, or recently I should say, our new Onassis Fellow. He is affiliated with the Institute and came here from Leuven just a month ago or so, approximately. And he will be spending the next 6 months with us and here in Athens. So if you return, I'm sure you will meet him many times. And we are very pleased to have you here, and this is the first kind of official event. So yes, so we are very pleased, and we look forward to the collaboration. Dr. Ivanovic has worked on the intersection between patristics, one could say, and philosophy. Has written a lot on Maximus the Confessor, who seems to be very much in fashion at the moment, because I think I see this Maximus literature all over the place. And also Dionysius the Areopagite. He has worked on a lot on the concept of beauty. He has his connection with Norway is that he has been a research fellow for 4 years at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. And since also Trondheim University the university in Trondheim is one of our owners, we are also very pleased to have someone who is kind of a representative from there. Tonight, this is also his first lecture at the Institute. He will speak to us on philosophy and likeness to God, early Christian development of a Platonic theme. So please.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for coming. As you heard, this is my first lecture here at the Institute, so it is a pleasure to be introduced in this way to the Athenian community. As you heard, I work mainly on the intersections between philosophy and theology, Byzantine philosophy, patristics, early Christianity. So this will be a sort of a short presentation of what I actually do. So I will try to combine a little bit both. So philosophy and likeness to God, early Christian development of a Platonic theme, and you can see this title over the famous picture of Raphael that represents the School of Athens. So of course it is a beautiful picture, but I did not take it to be the background for this lecture by chance. But as you can see, in the middle we have Plato and Aristotle represented here, and Plato is pointing with his finger up and Aristotle is pointing down. Unfortunately, I'm not the first one to notice that, but it's a nice thing to start. That you see the soul in some way. Plato is pointing to the heaven and Aristotle is pointing to the ground, which would in some way present the difference between Plato and Aristotle, the heavenly Plato and the down-to-earth Aristotle. So many scholars have argued that precisely this difference is the reason why perhaps Plato is not so popular or so well perceived in the contemporary philosophy, especially in contemporary ethics, but there is more emphasis on Aristotle. And actually these two themes that I chose for the title, philosophy and likeness to God, in some way also represent this, the reason for this. We will start with two of the very famous dictums of Plato. The first one is sort of Plato's definition of philosophy, where he says that philosophy is basically training for death. And this is what you have here, that other people are likely not to be aware that those who pursue philosophy aright study nothing but dying and being dead. So obviously at first sight this is not a very simple thing to understand. It is not very appealing that if you want to be a philosopher it means that you look forward to dying. Another thing when Plato spoke about philosophy is that he said that wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. So somehow it seems that for Plato philosophy begins in wonder and ends in death. But what he does explain in further lines of his dialogue is that this death is not a destruction. It's not a destruction of being or falling into nothingness, but it is on the contrary, it implies the liberation of pure thought, by which the immortal soul gains the highest forms of knowledge. So what he is talking about here is the, let's say, bodily death, which represents a passage from corruptibility and mortality towards their opposites, towards immortality. This is also one of the things and aspects of Plato's philosophy that found quite an embrace in early Christian and Christian in general philosophy and theology. The second passage that I chose here, and which also exemplifies the title of this lecture, is from Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, and this is where Plato talks about likeness to God. So he says, "But it is impossible that evil should be done away with, Theodorus, for there must always be something opposed to the good, and they cannot have their place among the gods, but must inevitably hover about mortal nature and this earth. So what we should do? Therefore, we ought to try to escape from earth to the dwelling of the gods as quickly as we can, and to escape is to become like God so far as this is possible, and to become like God is to become righteous and holy and wise." So this must have been a very, let's say, strange thing to say to Plato's audience in ancient Greece. I mean, when you say we have to be like God, which God? Does it refer to Zeus? Does it refer to some other Olympian deity? What does it actually mean? So I'm sure that the contemporary readers of Plato were a bit puzzled, and not just them. Also our contemporary scholars were quite puzzled by this, they call it digression in Theaetetus. And some scholars have said that not much attention has been paid to this passage until some 2 or 3 decades ago, and they have struggled to understand what really Plato means by this. And this is also one of the things that is exemplified by the picture, the Athenian School by Raphael that we saw earlier. So again, here Plato appears to be too spiritual, too heavenly oriented, escaping from this world, becoming like God. Those are all sayings that cannot be really grasped easily and cannot be perhaps realized or performed in our lives. So what the difference here is, we could say, is between an escapist and a spiritualist, so to say, idea of dying, of philosophy is being trained for that, and escaping this world and going to some other better place on the one hand, and on the other a practical, that is ethical component of this saying, because what Plato says is that becoming like God means to become righteous and holy and wise. So, if the contemporary scholarship is a bit puzzled by it, as I think I will show, the early Christians were not, and they were all too happy to read these phrases and to embrace them and to make them part of their own philosophical and theological systems. For example, Clement of Alexandria would say that there is no absurdity in philosophies having been given by divine providence to the Greeks as a preparatory discipline for the perfection which is through Christ. So Clement spent a lot of time arguing about the positiveness, about the positive character of philosophy, and about how every true Christian should be well versed in philosophy. What he was saying is that, unlike some other thinkers of that time, is that our spiritual production, so to say, does not start with the coming of Christ and does not start with the Bible, but that all of the human cultural and spiritual productions even before Christ should be taken into account. And what he was saying is that one should study absolute philosophy. By this he meant not just philosophy of Plato or just philosophy of Aristotle or just the Stoics and so on, but that Christians should identify what has been said true in all of these different pagan schools in order to come to what he called absolute philosophy, so a totality of thought, so to say. So for Clement, the purpose of philosophy remained the same as for Plato, dying to the corrupted, impassioned world and reaching immortality. And on the other hand, the practical side of this philosophy became ascetic practice. So this was also not strange to ancient philosophers and to the Christian thinkers, namely the Stoics. They also talked about exercising your soul and exercising your body and so on. And in fact, this word that we now use, ascetics, it comes from the Greek askesis, which means practice or exercise. So all of philosophy in fact became an exercise, and Christians were quite happy to embrace this kind of idea and conception of philosophy as an exercise, which later became also very important in the monastic practices. Now this is a sort of showing how did this Plato's idea of likeness further develop. So here we have a passage from Proclus, a Neoplatonic philosopher. I will not read everything, but he says that things are bound together by likeness and are distinguished and severed by unlikeness. And so the reversion of the epistrophe, or the return, means a communion and conjunction, and all communion and conjunction is through likeness. So it follows that all reversion must be accomplished through likeness. This is an explication of a very interesting and famous Neoplatonic idea of the moni proodos epistrophe, that is rest, proceeding or motion, and return. So all beings were once in the union, then out of this union they proceed out, and then finally they return. This is also one of the developments of Plato's philosophy, which was very interesting to Christians, and they quite easily understood it. But why is it so? So when we talk about likeness, we should remember what the Bible says, that God created man in the image and likeness of God. So for Christians it was very easy and quite entertaining to see this conception of likeness as part of their own religious and intellectual inheritance. The difference, that is the development of that idea in Christianity, is that one can hardly reconcile the idea that the man or human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and that we live in this world which is full of death, corruptibility, mortality, decay, and so on, evil even. So what they came up with is that God created his beings in the image, and this image of God persists and continues to be in the beings even after the fall, after what happened in the Garden of Eden, and after human beings becoming mortal. But likeness is something that has been lost with the fall. So the task of the humanity is to regain this likeness. And so here we are again, we talk in the terms of Plato and of Proclus and of Neoplatonists, that the purpose of human beings is to regain the likeness to God. This is of course done not just by, as we have in Plato on one side, escaping this world and going to some other world, but by a very concrete and practical life, which would consist in ethical behavior, or as Plato would say, justice and wisdom. So Christians very easily developed these ideas, and developed them, of course, further. What was of their help is not just the biblical narrative and early apologetics and so on, but also again Plato. Because if Plato says that being like God means to be just, holy and wise, that means that the true model of justice, holiness and wisdom is God. And he also says in the laws, through the mouth of the Athenian stranger, that God will be the measure of all things in the highest degree, a degree much higher than is any man they talk of. So this is clearly an anti-sophist passage. It is pointed against Protagoras, who said man is the measure of all things. And Plato, of course, attacks this kind of view and says that, argues that we cannot limit ourselves to this kind of subjectivistic or relativistic ideas, because if we say that the man is the measure of all things, it means that every individual man is the measure of all things, which again means that each of us, each individual man, has his own or her own standards and principles by which to measure everything. Plato says no, there must be something which is much higher than human being, and something that posits objective and universal principles by which everything can be measured. And he says that is God. Another very important aspect of all of this when we talk about likeness of God is that perhaps the ancient readers of Plato could not identify who was the God that he was talking about, which one of many deities, or maybe some other new deity and so on. For Christians that was very easy, because in the biblical narrative and in the, as they believed, in the historical sequence of events, God became human. He gave his son Jesus Christ to the humanity. He came to earth, he did some things, he was crucified, and then he resurrected. So what does it mean to be like God? It means to imitate Christ, because Christ is the second person of the Trinity of God, and Christ is the Son of God, becomes a true and real and palpable model of behavior. So we are not talking anymore about some unknown, so to say, faceless, touchless Olympian gods, or about an unknown God from the Old Testament who is quite strict and who punishes his creation. Now we are talking about one of us, one of human beings who became human, who had his voice, his face, who lived a certain period of time on earth, who did concrete things, and finally got killed because of it. So being like God for Christians means imitating Christ, who became the real role model and example of right behavior. So here we return to the one Christian thinker that I mentioned before, Clement of Alexandria, who here talks about likeness to God. And he says he is the Gnostic. The Gnostic for Clement was the true Christian, the true initiator, the true philosopher, so to say. He was a man initiated in the secrets of religion, but also very well versed in philosophy, whose task was not just to care about himself and about his well-being, but also to instruct others, to initiate other Christians. So this true Gnostic, true Christian, who is after the image and likeness of God and imitates God as far as possible, is deficient in none of the things which contribute to the likeness as far as compatible, practicing self-restraint and endurance, living righteously, reigning over the passions, bestowing what he has as far as possible, and doing proof both by word and deed. So this is Clement's further development of what we saw in Plato. So likeness to God for Plato is to be just and holy and wise. And here Clement develops this idea further, but saying that it also includes self-restraint, endurance, righteous life, victory over passions, bestowing of what he has, and doing good things both by word and by deed. So what this shows us is what I mentioned just a few moments ago, that for Christians this idea of becoming like God was not some sort of an otherworldly, too spiritual idea that common people could not understand. Here we have an example of how Christians understood these ideas in a very concrete and practical way. So what they are saying is, if you want to be like God, that means that you have to practice it. You have to practice endurance, you have to win your passions, you have to endure, you have to give everything that you have in the measure that you can, and you have to do good things by both word and deed. However, of course, in Christianity, this is not the only necessary thing that you have to do. It's not enough that you just lead an ethical life and be a good person, because people can be good persons and not do any harm and lead quite a moral life even without believing in one God, or without being educated and without being initiated into the, so to say, secrets of the religious life. So that's why Clement says there is another thing. So besides the practical life, there is also contemplative life. And that means in the contemplative life then, one in worshipping God attends to himself, and through his own spotless purification beholds the holy God holily, for self-control being present, serving and contemplating in self uninterruptedly, is as far as possible assimilated to God. So apart from leading the practical life, apart from honoring and respecting ethical prescriptions, there is also another aspect of one's life, which is the contemplative life. It means contemplation of the world and contemplation of nature. And this is again achieved by a sort of a death, just like in Plato, because it separates the soul from the body and promotes the soul to a life entirely devoted to the good, and allowing it to devote itself to the contemplation of genuine realities, as he might say, with a purified mind. Clement was, of course, not the only one influenced by Plato and by ancient philosophical tradition. There was another very peculiar character that we now call Dionysius Pseudo-Areopagite, who took the name from the famous bishop of Athens, and there's a street named Dionysius Areopagite quite close by. So the author of these works is not the bishop of Athens, but it is an anonymous writer who just took the pseudonym of the famous bishop of Athens. And probably that was not by chance, because Dionysius, the real Dionysius, was a pagan who then converted into Christianity and became the bishop of Athens. So some have claimed that perhaps also the author of the Corpus Dionysiacum, as it is called, is probably someone who was pagan, very well versed in Neoplatonism and philosophy in general, who then converted to Christianity and perhaps and probably became a monk. So in one of his very important works that is called Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, where he explains all the ranks and orders of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, meaning bishops, priests, monks, holy people, and so on. Also the different rites of baptism, funeral rites, communion, that is Eucharist, etc. He says that the blessed deity, which transcends everything and which is one and also triune, has resolved, for a reason unclear to us but obvious to itself, to ensure the salvation of rational beings, both ourselves and those beings who are our superior. Our superior beings, he most probably thinks angels, because angels, according to him, are pure intelligences. This can only happen with the divinization or deification of the saved. And divinization consists of being as much as possible like and in union with God. Again, therefore, this idea of Plato and of Proclus returns here in terms of union and likeness. Deification, that means human beings becoming gods, is also another very strange and peculiar idea that is inherent to this, as we might call it Eastern or Orthodox Christian part of the world, which was quite not very easily understandable to the Westerners. But anyway, and some have claimed that these ideas of deification or divinization are not inherently Christian, but they come from the, so to say, Hellenization of Christian thought in the early centuries, and the influence of Hellenic or Greek philosophy to Christian thought. So, as I said, what he combines here is the previously quoted Proclus's dictum that the likeness is the sort of vehicle of union, and Plato's idea that one should become as far as possible like God. So Dionysius somehow packs everything in with this biblical idea where deification per se does not appear, but there is a passage in the Bible that says you will be in communion with God, being together with God, and he develops the idea of deification, that every being, especially the rational beings, will become saved, and this salvation will consist in divinization that is deification. So why I put this is to exemplify how this idea, ancient Plato's ideas of purpose of the human life being like God, has not been completely brought to the end, but this is how it was developed by the Christians. Now this ideal of being like God receives its end. The end is the deification of the being, that is, the human being becoming God. So let me just go through another interesting passage by Dionysius when he talks about the beauty of the world and the beauty of God. So true beauty is hidden beauty according to Dionysius, and it is beyond understanding, and it is safeguarded, so to say, from profanation. However, in the same time as it is hidden, it is also revealed, but only to the minds that are capable of grasping it, and when it shows in appropriate images. So he says, and this is a quotation, "They reveal themselves solely to the minds capable of grasping them. They shine within our souls only by way of appropriate images, images which, like themselves, have the virtue of being incorruptible. Hence, virtue's conformity to God can only appear as an authentic image of its object when it rivets its attention on that conceptual and fragrant beauty. On this condition, and only on this condition, can the soul impress itself and reproduce within itself an imitation of loveliness or of beauty." So as you can see, that this passage is quite pregnant with aesthetic terms, and again the idea of likeness and conformity returns in this passage. And there are three things that one should mention regarding this passage. First, the hidden and transcendent beauty is always revealed in appropriate images. Second, even those revealed images cannot be grasped by everyone, but only by those capable of doing so. And thirdly, the only way that the soul can imitate the divine beauty is to constantly look upon the archetype, at the transcendent beauty. So this concentration enables sacred men, as Dionysius would call them, to produce the likeness of God, and in doing so, they, and this is again a quotation, never cease to shape the power of their minds along the lines of a loveliness, beauty, which is conceptual, transcendent, and fragrant. So, as you could infer from this, the conception of the image, of the likeness to God and of deification does not have only these theological or ethical aspects, but it also has the aesthetic aspects in itself. And of course, as mentioned by Aaron in the introduction, one of my favorites, Maximus the Confessor, who is now, as you said, living a revival. I think every day there's a book or article on Maximus. So he was also very keen on developing and furthering this idea of likeness. And as the example of likeness, of how this likeness is realized among us, he takes Moses. And he says that Moses, taking God himself as the type and exemplar of the virtues, he modeled himself on him like a picture expertly capturing the likeness of the archetype. So again, sort of an aesthetic dialogue here, because on the one hand he says that Moses modeled himself as a picture that captures the likeness of the model or of the archetype, and on the other hand, the ethical aspect of all of this is that he modeled himself according to God, who is the exemplar of the virtues. So you see, likeness of God again has both ethical and aesthetic implications. So again, a very important passage by Maximus that will introduce a further aspect that I will shortly discuss, is this passage that says, for it is from the beginning that one received being and participation to what is naturally good, and it is by conforming to the beginning through the inclination of his will and by free choice, this is the very important thing, that he hastens to the end, diligently adhering to the praiseworthy course that conducts him unerringly to his point of origin. Having completed this course, such a person becomes God, receiving from God to be God, for the beautiful nature inherent in the fact that he is God, in God's image, he freely chose to add the likeness to God by means of the virtues. So I think that most of it is clear that one who wants to be deified has to again conform to God as an archetype, has to model himself or herself according to God's to the divinity. But another very important aspect here introduced by Maximus is the free will. So as you can see, the inclination of his will and by free choice, and that he freely added the likeness to God by means of the virtues. And this is one of the major contributions of Maximus the Confessor to the overall Christian theology, which is the affirmation and insistence on the free will of human beings, which means that salvation or deification, or if you want ethics and whatever, is not imposed to human beings as a necessity, but it has to be freely accepted. It has to be accepted by the exercise of the free will. So this is perhaps also one of the answers to the constant question why there is evil in the world. The evil in the world is in the free will of the individuals, because although God in the Christian conception as omniscient, omnipotent and so on, of course he knows what kind of evil will happen, he has the means to prevent it, but he chooses not to do it because he leaves it to the free will of human beings. Even the fall was sort of a distortion and distortive use of the free will on the part of the human beings. So this likeness to God and deification which follows from it has to be freely accepted, it has to be freely chosen, and the likeness to God has to be added, and you can see in the last part, again a very important emphasis on ethics, which says by means of the virtues. So as I said in the case of Dionysius, also for Maximus, the true model according to which one has to model himself or herself is of course Christ, because he is the closest and the most real example that one has. So he who loves Christ certainly imitates him as much as he can. Thus Christ never ceased to do good to men. When he was treated with ingratitude and blasphemed, he was long suffering. When he was struck by them and put to death, he endured, imputing evil to no one at all. So these three are the works of love for neighbor, apart from which the man deceives himself who says he loves Christ or has reached his kingdom. If we had in this passage by Plato that likeness to God means justice, wisdom and holiness, this is of course true also for Christian thinkers and also for Maximus himself, but for Maximus the summit of all virtues is love. It is the double commandment of love, which says love thy God and love thy neighbor. So what he says, all other virtues, they somehow come out of this chief virtue, which is love. And somehow if you can fulfill this double commandment of love, to love your God and to love your neighbor, it means that you will in the same time be also just and holy and wise and plenty giving and so on and so on. let's for a moment go back to the first dictum with which we started, the one that philosophy is preparation for death. Actually, this passage, this sentence by Plato, was even quoted directly by Gregory Nazianzen, one of the early Christian thinkers, who says, "Make of this life, as Plato said, a training for death, while, to speak in his terms, separating the soul from the body as far as possible. This is the practice of philosophy." That's what Gregory says. And Maximus, he inherits this idea and says, "In the conformity with the philosophy of Christ, let us make our life a training for death." So this death that he is talking about is the death of the present life in its distorted and corrupted state. And to live in this condition means to live in death, which is a paradoxical phrase, but very potent. And that is why this life should be put off. It should be casted away by asceticism, by spiritual exercise, in order to gain the perfect and stable state of the true and original life. And again, Maximus will conclude, "For I do not think that the end of this present life is rightly called death, but deliverance from death, and separation from corruption, and freedom from slavery, and rest from trouble, and escape from battles, and the way past confusion, and retreat from darkness, and relaxation from labors, and the silencing of inarticulate noise, and stillness of seething, and the covering of shame, and flight from the passions, and disappearance of sin, in short, the circumscription of all evils." So of course it is a very exaggerated passage that would make you think that everything with this world is wrong and everything with the body is wrong, that all evils are concentrated in this world. But of course, for Maximus as well as for the other Christians, the very creation of human being in body and soul, meaning in matter and non-matter, is acceptable, and body as such and matter as such has to be valued. But the point is that in this life human beings are giving too much credit to the matter and to the bodily pleasures. And this is actually what Plato would say in that passage from Theaetetus, where he says, before that Socrates, he presents philosopher in quite a, we could say, comic way, that he says he's an otherworldly person, he doesn't know if he is shaved or if his beard is long, he doesn't know where the agora is or the marketplace, he doesn't know where the courthouse is, and so on and so on. And he even tells a story about Thales, as we are used to consider him the first philosopher who died, or who fell in a well, and his maid said, "My master knows what's in the skies, but he doesn't know what's below his feet." So of course this is an exaggerated and a bit comic picture of a philosopher, because I guess that even in those times philosophers did know if they are shaved or not, and did know where the marketplace is. I mean, Socrates definitely knew where everything was in his city, and probably knew everyone, because he asked so many questions, all of the people whom he met. But it is a description of how this likeness to God and how this ideal of human life is to be achieved. It is precisely the critique of those who put so much value and so much value on bodily pleasures, on wine, food, sex, and so on. So what he is saying, and what Maximus is saying, and what most of or all of the Christian thinkers are saying, is that one should free himself and herself from the passions. I have quite a lot more to say, but I will now be concluding by one. I think it's a very interesting and quite striking similarity between Plato and precisely Maximus the Confessor. So as I said, this passage about likeness to God was very controversial, and contemporary scholars were quite struggling how to define it. So one of the solutions that would cast away the otherworldly, heavenly idea of Plato is that in some dialogues God is by Plato identified with nous, that is with intelligence or mind. So what the point is with the whole idea of likeness to God is, to put it more simply, to become more intelligent and to put order in our life. This is of course quite true. It's not untrue, especially if we have in mind the famous Platonic division of the soul into the rational, irascible and concupiscible elements, which were again taken by the Christian thinkers. So in proving this idea of how the likeness to God is more of this world than of the other, scholars have quoted a myth in the Phaedo, where this myth describes a beautiful true earth as it appears from above, adorned with colorful seas, plants, precious stones, so that it is a sight for blessed onlookers to behold. So the idea is that when you put your intelligence or your nous in charge, that means that it's not that this world is to be destroyed or abandoned. It means that when the nous is controlling you, then you become this blessed onlooker. So the world becomes beautiful, and you see it's very pregnant with aesthetic terms like colorful seas, plants, precious stones, and so on. But I think that perhaps Maximus, also the Confessor, read this passage or understood quite well Plato's idea of likeness and of this, let's say, a new world that appears very beautiful with when your nous is in charge. And what he says is that the beauty, the hidden beauty, the incomprehensible beauty of God is the beauty that wounds the beholder and incites him to emulate it in order to be adorned with the proper modes of virtues through noble action. And practicing the virtues leads to the good use of the senses, through which the soul becomes beautified with divine splendors, and it is thus able to create a universe of spiritual beauty. And this is the quotation from Maximus. If the soul, in drawing on its own powers, makes proper use of the senses, singling out the manifold principles of beings, and being able wisely to transfer it to itself the whole of what it sees, in which God is concealed and silently proclaimed, it will have succeeded in creating, by the mind's power of free choice, a superlatively bodacious and spiritual world within itself. So this reminds me of this Plato's idea of how when you how you can see, or so to say create, this beautiful world if your soul is properly, so to say, arranged. So in conclusion, what this lecture was all about is to show how, through a few examples, because we don't have much time, through a few examples, how the Christian philosophers and thinkers were quite easy to embrace and to understand these ideas of Plato, of philosophy as training for death or preparation for death, and of the telos, or the purpose of human life is to become like God. They of course enriched it with the specifically Christian ideas and some biblical narrative, but so to say concluded or brought to conclusion these ideas by Plato, which some have treated as digressions. They brought them to conclusion in the soteriological idea of deification or salvation. So And let me just conclude with an anecdote that I just remembered. There was one famous Serbian philosopher, Branislav Petronijević, who was perhaps the most original thinker of all times in the at least ex-Yugoslavian region. So some 60, 70 years ago, he was walking through Belgrade streets with one of his students who would eventually become a prominent intellectual himself. And during this walk, he asked him, Plato or Aristotle? And the student said, Aristotle. And Petronijević replied, I'm so sorry to say, but you will never become a true philosopher. So obviously, and Petronijević was, as he used to call himself, a sworn metaphysician. So perhaps in dealing with these Platonic digressions that still incite some difficulties, we might also go back to some earlier times, to some Byzantine Christian thinkers, and see what was the perception and reception of these ideas there, so we could perhaps more easily understand them. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for